March 26th, 1945. Führerbunker, Berlin. Adolf Hitler stands before a map of Germany, his hands trembling. Before him, red arrows mark the advance of American forces. One arrow moves faster than all others. In 72 hours, it has covered nearly 600 miles, from the Rhine River deep into the heart of Bavaria. Hitler stabs his finger at the map. "This is impossible," he says. "No army can move this fast." His generals stand in silence. They know the truth. The impossible is happening. General Patton's Third Army is tearing through Germany like nothing the Wehrmacht has ever faced. Not in Poland, not in France, not in Russia. And the most terrifying thing is not the speed. It is that Patton shows no sign of slowing down. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The story of this advance begins not in March of 1945, but months earlier, when the German High Command still believed they could win. When they thought American tanks were slow, American logistics chaotic, American commanders cautious, they were wrong on every count. And the man who would prove them wrong was a 59-year-old general who had spent his entire life preparing for this moment. George Smith Patton, Jr. A man who believed that war was decided not by holding ground, but by never stopping. In August of 1944, after the breakout from Normandy, Patton's Third Army raced across France. In 1 month, they covered 400 miles. The Germans fell back in chaos. But then, at the Moselle River, Patton was forced to stop, not by German resistance, by gasoline. The Supreme Allied Command diverted fuel to Field Marshal Montgomery's operation in the Netherlands. Patton's tanks sat idle for weeks. His men watched as precious time slipped away. The general paced like a caged animal. "Every day, we wait," he told his staff. "Is another day. The Germans build defenses." He was right. By December, the Germans had gathered strength for one final gamble, the Ardennes offensive, what the Americans would call the Battle of the Bulge. On December 16, 1944, 200,000 German troops smashed into American lines. The weather was terrible. Snow, fog, freezing cold, perfect conditions for the attack. The Germans drove a bulge 50 miles deep into Allied territory. They surrounded the town of Bastogne, where the U.S. 101st Airborne Division held on desperately. At Supreme Headquarters, there was near panic. The German breakthrough threatened to split the Allied armies in two. Eisenhower called an emergency meeting on December 19th. All the senior commanders gathered. The mood was grim. Everyone except Patton. When Eisenhower asked how soon Third Army could disengage from its current positions, turn 90 degrees north, and attack the German flank, the room fell silent. Such a maneuver was extraordinarily complex. It would require moving 3 divisions, nearly 100,000 men with all their equipment and supplies, across icy roads in the middle of winter. Most commanders would need a week, perhaps 2, Patton said. 48 hours. The other generals thought he was joking. Eisenhower asked him to be serious. Patton insisted. 48 hours. He had already drawn up 3 contingency plans. Before the meeting, he had given orders to his staff. By the time he left the room, his corps commanders were receiving movement orders. It was not improvisation. It was preparation meeting opportunity. On December 22nd, 72 hours after receiving the order, Patton's 4th Armored Division smashed into the German lines south of Bastogne. The Germans were caught completely by surprise. They had expected no American response for at least a week. By December 26th, Patton's tanks broke through to Bastogne. The siege was lifted. The German offensive collapsed. But this was only the beginning. What Patton had done in the Ardennes, moving fast and hitting hard, would become his signature for the rest of the war. And in March of 1945, he would execute a movement so rapid, so audacious, that even his own superiors could hardly believe it. The Rhine River was the last great natural barrier protecting Germany. For centuries, it had been considered nearly impenetrable. The Germans had destroyed all the bridges. They fortified the eastern bank with artillery, machine gun nests, mines. Every military expert agreed. Crossing the Rhine would be difficult, costly, bloody. Field Marshal Montgomery planned his crossing for weeks. He assembled a massive force, conducted elaborate preparations, scheduled the operation for late March. Patton had other ideas. On March 22, 1945, his 5th Infantry Division crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim, south of Mainz. They used assault boats. No massive preparation, no prolonged bombardment, just speed and surprise. By dawn, they had a bridgehead. By evening, engineers were building a pontoon bridge. Within 24 hours, tanks were rolling across. The Germans barely had time to react. Patton called Eisenhower's Chief of Staff, General Bradley. "I crossed the Rhine before Montgomery," he said, and without even a press conference. It was a dig at Montgomery, who had planned his crossing as a major media event. But it was also a demonstration of Patton's philosophy. Don't wait. Don't announce. Just do it. Now the door to Germany stood open, and Patton intended to drive through it at full speed. March 23rd. 3rd Army Headquarters, a commandeered German school building east of the Rhine. Patton gathered his corps commanders. The map showed open country ahead, rolling hills, scattered towns, light German resistance. The Wehrmacht was collapsing. Units were surrendering in thousands. But there were also rumors. Rumors of a national redoubt in the Bavarian Alps, where fanatical SS troops would make a last stand. Rumors of concentration camps. Rumors of prisoners of war held deep in enemy territory. Patton's orders were simple. Do not stop. Bypass strongpoints. Leave them for the follow-on infantry. The armor would advance continuously, day and night. Fuel trucks would meet them on the move. Maintenance would be performed while rolling. Any tank that broke down would be abandoned and its crew transferred to another vehicle. Speed, he told them, is our armor. The faster we move, the fewer casualties we take. The Germans cannot hit what they cannot catch. His subordinates understood. This was not about taking territory. It was about destroying the German army's ability to resist, about reaching objectives before the enemy could organize defense, about ending the war through movement. On March 24th, the advance began. The 5th Infantry Division pushed out from the Rhine bridgehead. Behind them came the 4th Armored Division, Patton's best. Tank columns stretched for miles, Sherman tanks, M18 Hellcat tank destroyers, half-tracks carrying infantry, supply trucks, fuel tankers, ambulances, a mechanized army moving as one organism. The first day, they covered 40 miles. The second, 55. By March 26th, advance elements were 120 miles beyond the Rhine. German resistance was sporadic, confused. Wehrmacht units found themselves surrounded before they even knew American tanks were in the area. Entire divisions surrendered without firing a shot. Staff Sergeant Michael Polanski, a tank commander in the 4th Armored, later recalled, "We moved so fast, we outran our own maps. Sometimes we didn't know what town we were in. We'd see a road sign, try to find it on the map, and realize we were 30 miles ahead of where we thought. The Germans were just as confused. We'd roll into a village, and they'd wave, thinking we were their own troops falling back. But not all encounters were bloodless." On March 27th, near the town of Aschaffenburg, a company of SS troops made a stand. They had 2 88mm anti-tank guns and a company of infantry. For 6 hours, they held up the 4th Armored's advance. Patton was furious. He radioed the division commander, "I don't care how many Germans are there, go through them, around them, or over them, but don't stop." The division bypassed the town, leaving 1 battalion to contain the SS troops. The rest of the column kept moving. That night, they covered another 40 miles. The speed created logistical nightmares. Fuel was the constant problem. A Sherman tank carried 175 gallons of gasoline and consumed roughly 1 gallon per mile on roads, more cross-country. At the rate 3rd Army was moving, each tank needed refueling every day. Multiply that by hundreds of tanks, plus thousands of trucks, jeeps, and half-tracks, and the fuel demand became enormous. Patton's solution was the Red Ball Express system, perfected during the race across France. Convoys of fuel trucks ran continuously, day and night. They met the armor columns at prearranged points, often while the tanks were still moving. Tankers would pull alongside, and crews would refuel on the march. It was dangerous. Gasoline spills were common. More than 1 soldier died in fires caused by refueling accidents. But it kept the advance going. Colonel Walter Richardson, 3rd Army's chief logistics officer, calculated that in the last week of March, they delivered over 3 million gallons of gasoline. That's enough to fill 5 Olympic swimming pools, and we did it while moving forward at 50 miles per day. Food was another challenge. Troops ate sea rations, individual tins of meat, crackers, and fruit. Monotonous, but portable. Hot meals were rare. Soldiers joked that they would win the war just to get a steak dinner. But morale remained high. They could see the effect of their advance. Every day, hundreds of German prisoners, every day, closer to the end. Meanwhile, in Berlin, the atmosphere grew desperate. March 28th, the daily military briefing. Hitler demanded updates on the Western Front. General Alfred Jodl, chief of the operations staff, stood before the map. The red arrows showing American advances had grown longer. Patton's Third Army had reached Frankfurt, was pushing toward Kassel, had advance elements near the Czechoslovak border. "How many divisions does Patton have?" Hitler asked. 12, perhaps 15, Jodl replied. "But they are spread over a vast area." "Then destroy them," Hitler ordered. "They are overextended. Cut them off." But with what? Jodl thought. Every reserve had been committed to the Ardennes. Every available unit was already engaged. There were no forces left to cut off Patton. The best they could do was delay, harass, hope to slow him down. German commanders in the field saw the reality more clearly. General Hermann Balck, commanding Army Group G, wrote in his diary on March 29th, "The American advance is unlike anything we faced in the East. The Soviets advanced in mass, overwhelming through numbers. The Americans advance through speed. They bypass our strongpoints, strike our rear areas, disrupt our communications. We cannot form a coherent defense when we do not know where they will appear next." A panzer commander, Major Hans von Luck, later recounted, "We received orders to establish a defensive line. By the time we reached the position, American tanks were already 30 kilometers beyond it. We were defending against ghosts. The psychological impact was devastating. German soldiers, even veterans of the Eastern Front, found themselves facing an enemy that seemed to be everywhere at once. Rumors spread. Patton has 1,000 tanks. Patton's men don't need sleep. Patton can see through fog. Nonsense, of course, but in the chaos of collapse, soldiers believed anything. The truth was more prosaic, but equally effective. Patton had about 800 tanks in his armored divisions. His men were exhausted, many running on 3 or 4 hours of sleep per night. And he couldn't see through fog, but he had something almost as good. Excellent intelligence, superb communications, and commanders trained to act independently. Third Army used a system called reconnaissance in force. Light tanks and armored cars probed ahead, looking for weak spots in German lines. When they found one, they radioed back. Headquarters dispatched a combat command, a flexible task force of tanks, infantry, and artillery. The combat command would punch through the weak spot, then race forward until meeting resistance. Then the process repeated. It was warfare as improvisation. No rigid plans, no detailed timetables, just a general direction, aggressive commanders, and the freedom to exploit opportunities. On March 30th, the 4th Armored Division reached Gotha. The town had a population of 50,000 and was defended by a battalion of Volkssturm, the German Home Guard, old men and boys armed with rifles and Panzerfausts, the German equivalent of bazookas. They had orders to fight to the death. The American commander, Major General Hugh Gaffey, had no intention of taking casualties fighting old men. He sent a captured German officer into town with a message. "Surrender now, and no one will be hurt. Resist, and we will level the town." The Volkssturm commander, a retired schoolteacher named Ernst Hoffmann, asked for an hour to decide. Gaffey gave him 15 minutes. At the end of 15 minutes, white flags appeared on the town hall. The defenders marched out and stacked their weapons. Total American casualties, 0. Total time delayed, 20 minutes. Not every encounter ended so peacefully. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. April 1st, Near the town of Merkers, soldiers of the 3rd Army's 90th Infantry Division discovered something extraordinary. A salt mine. German guards had fled. American engineers entered cautiously, worried about booby traps. What they found left them stunned. Gold bars, thousands of them, stacked floor to ceiling. Over 200 tons of gold bullion, the entire gold reserve of the German Reichsbank. There were also crates of currency from dozens of countries, art stolen from museums across Europe, and something more sinister, bags of jewelry, watches, eyeglasses, all taken from concentration camp victims. The discovery was reported up the chain. Patton himself came to inspect. He walked through the mine in silence. Seeing the stolen treasures was one thing. Seeing the personal effects of murdered people was another. "This is what we're fighting," he told his staff. "Remember this when you're tired. Remember when you think about slowing down." The gold was secured. The art catalogued. The personal effects would later be used as evidence at the Nuremberg trials. But the 3rd Army did not slow down. By April 3rd, they had crossed into Thuringia. They were now over 200 miles beyond the Rhine. In 8 days, 40 miles from the Czechoslovak border, 60 miles from Bavaria. The pace was staggering in comparison. During the rapid advance across France in August of 1944, Patton's army averaged 25 miles per day. Now, they were averaging over 40. What made the difference? Several factors. First, German resistance was collapsing. Units that in 1944 would have fought for days now surrendered after token resistance. The Wehrmacht was running out of fuel, ammunition, and hope. Second, the terrain was favorable. Central Germany had good roads, rolling hills, few major rivers, ideal for mechanized forces. Third, air superiority. The Luftwaffe had been destroyed. American fighter bombers roamed freely, attacking any German column that tried to move. This paralyzed enemy reinforcements and made it nearly impossible for the Germans to organize counterattacks. Fourth, experience. By April of 1945, 3rd Army had been in continuous combat for nearly a year. Commanders knew their jobs, soldiers knew their equipment, units functioned with practiced efficiency. But the most important factor was leadership. Patton drove his army relentlessly. He visited frontline units daily. He relieved commanders who hesitated. He rewarded those who showed initiative. His message was constant. Keep moving. Don't let them rest. Don't give them time to organize. Hit them again before they recover from the last blow. It was exhausting. Soldiers later described it as being in a trance. You didn't think, you just moved. Ate when you could, slept when the column stopped, woke when it started again. Days blurred together. Technical Sergeant James O'Donnell, an infantryman, recalled, "I remember crossing a river. I don't remember which one. I remember taking a town. I don't remember its name. Everything was motion. The lieutenant would point. We'd go that direction. Enemy resistance. We'd call for tanks. No resistance. Keep walking. I lost 15 pounds in 2 weeks. We all did. The physical toll was severe. But casualties were surprisingly light. In the entire month of March, the 3rd Army suffered fewer than 5,000 casualties, killed, wounded, and missing. This included all the fighting from the Rhine, crossing through the deep penetration into Germany. For comparison, in a single day, during the Battle of the Bulge, some American units took casualty rates of 30%. The reason was simple. A moving target is hard to hit. The Germans couldn't bring artillery to bear on units that were 50 miles away by the time the guns were positioned. They couldn't lay minefields in front of columns that changed direction every hour. They couldn't prepare ambushes when they didn't know the route of advance. Patton's philosophy proved correct. Speed was armor. By April 4th, advance elements reached the Werra River. This was significant. It meant 3rd Army had crossed the entire width of Germany from west to east in 2 weeks. They were now closer to Berlin than to the Rhine. Eisenhower, however, had other plans. Berlin would be left to the Soviets. 3rd Army would turn southeast into Bavaria and Austria. The objective was to prevent any German retreat into an Alpine redoubt, also to liberate prisoner of war camps known to be in the region. Patton was disappointed. He wanted Berlin. He believed 3rd Army could reach it before the Soviets, but orders were orders. On April 5th, the axis of advance shifted south, and here the pace increased even more. The final push toward Bavaria saw some of the fastest advances of the entire war. The 11th Armored Division covered 90 miles in 2 days. The 4th Armored, exhausted but still effective, pushed 65 miles in a single 24-hour period. German units simply disintegrated. Thousands of soldiers walked west, hands raised, looking for someone to surrender to. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. On April 8th, near the town of Ohrdruf, soldiers of the 4th Armored Division discovered something that would haunt them forever. A concentration camp, the first liberated by American forces. Patton, Bradley, and Eisenhower all visited within days. What they saw required no words. The emaciated prisoners, the piles of corpses, the ovens. Eisenhower ordered every American unit in the area to tour the camp. He wanted soldiers to see what they were fighting against. He ordered photographers and film crews to document everything. He knew there would be those who would deny it happened. He wanted evidence that could not be questioned. Patton, a man not easily shaken, was physically sick. He later wrote in his diary, "We are fighting against something that is evil in a way I had not fully comprehended. The speed of our advance has saved thousands of lives in these camps. Every day we delay means more die." The Third Army pushed on. By April 10th, they had entered Bavaria. By April 11th, reached the Danube River. By April 13th, elements of the 11th Armored Division crossed into Austria. In 3 weeks, from the Rhine to Austria, over 600 miles, some units had covered even more ground, advancing, withdrawing, flanking. The logistical miracle behind this advance cannot be overstated. Third Army consumed over 15,000 tons of supplies per day: ammunition, fuel, food, medical supplies, spare parts. All of it had to be transported from depots hundreds of miles behind the lines, over roads clogged with refugees, prisoners, and other military traffic. The Red Ball Express ran continuously. Drivers worked shifts of 20 hours. Mechanics performed repairs by the roadside. Accidents were common. More than 200 supply trucks were lost to crashes, breakdowns, and occasional German attacks. But the supplies kept flowing. One quartermaster officer calculated that if all the supply trucks supporting Third Army in April were placed end to end, they would stretch over 100 miles, and that column moved forward every day, keeping pace with the advancing tanks. Meanwhile, in Berlin, the end was approaching. April 15th, the Führerbunker. Hitler received reports of Soviet armies closing on Berlin from the east, American armies deep in Bavaria, British forces approaching Hamburg. The Reich was cut into isolated pockets, all communications disrupted, all hope gone. An aide mentioned Patton's name in a briefing. Hitler's reaction was one of the few documented instances where he acknowledged an Allied commander by name. He said, according to witnesses, "Patton is an unusually aggressive commander. He understood how to use armor, as we intended. If Germany had such commanders, we would not be in this situation." It was perhaps the closest Hitler came to admitting defeat, not because of numbers, not because of resources, but because the other side had better commanders. Within 2 weeks, Hitler would be dead. Germany would surrender. The war in Europe would end. But Patton's advance did not stop until May 8th, VE Day. By then, Third Army had reached Linz, Austria. They had liberated dozens of prisoner-of-war camps, freeing tens of thousands of Allied soldiers. They had captured hundreds of thousands of German troops. They had seized vast stores of enemy equipment and supplies, and they had demonstrated, once and for all, that modern warfare belonged to those who could move fastest. The final statistics of Third Army's operations from March 22nd to May 8th are staggering. They advanced over 700 miles. They captured over 700,000 German soldiers. They liberated over 12,000 towns and cities. They freed 15 concentration camps and dozens of prisoner-of-war camps. Casualties were remarkably light relative to the gains. Total losses from Rhine crossing to war's end were approximately 16,000. This included killed, wounded, and missing, a casualty rate of less than 5%. In comparison, Soviet forces lost over 300,000 men, taking Berlin alone. British and Canadian forces suffered heavy casualties, breaking through the German fortifications in the north. Patton's methods, controversial and aggressive, saved lives, American lives, Allied lives, and even German lives, as the rapid advance prevented prolonged battles. After the war, military historians studied Third Army's March and April operations intensively. They concluded that the advance represented the pinnacle of mechanized warfare in World War II, faster than the German Blitzkrieg of 1940, more sustained than Soviet deep operations, more complex than British armored sweeps in North Africa. The keys to success were identified: aggressive leadership, willing to take risks; decentralized command, allowing subordinates to act independently; superior logistics, maintaining the advance; excellent intelligence, providing timely information; complete air superiority, protecting the columns; and soldiers trained, equipped, and motivated to keep moving no matter what. But above all, it was Patton's vision, his understanding that in modern war, speed matters more than mass, that keeping the enemy off balance prevents him from forming effective resistance, that the side that moves fastest dictates the terms of battle. General Omar Bradley wrote after the war, Patton's drive through Germany in 1945 was the most brilliant piece of generalship in the European theater. Some criticized him for being reckless, but recklessness that succeeds is called boldness. Even German commanders acknowledged it. General Heinz Guderian, architect of the Wehrmacht's armored doctrine, said in his memoirs, "Patton demonstrated a mastery of mobile warfare that exceeded our own practitioners. His advance from the Rhine was a textbook example of what we tried to achieve with panzer forces, but rarely accomplished at such scale and speed." The soldiers of Third Army had their own perspective. They were proud of what they accomplished. They knew they had done something extraordinary. But mostly they were just glad it was over. Sergeant Michael Polanski, the tank commander whose unit outran its maps, said years later, "People ask me about Patton. Was he a great general? I don't know. I was just a sergeant. But I know this. We followed him through hell, and he brought us out the other side. In 72 hours, we went from the Rhine to Bavaria. In 3 weeks, we crossed Germany. And when it was done, we were still standing. That's enough for me. Thank you for watching." For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. The story of Patton's advance cannot be fully understood without examining the machinery that made it possible. The tanks, the trucks, the radios, the weapons, every piece of equipment tested to its limits, every system pushed beyond what designers thought possible. The Sherman tank, America's workhorse, carried the burden. By March of 1945, most of Third Army's Shermans were M4A3 variants, powered by a Ford GAA V8 engine, producing 500 horsepower, weight 33 tons, maximum road speed 26 miles per hour. Though crews often pushed them faster, armor 76 millimeters at the front, enough to stop machine gun fire and shrapnel, not enough to stop German anti-tank guns. The Sherman had a reputation. German tankers called it the Tommy Cooker, or Ronson, because it lit on fire easily. American crews had a grimmer name, the Death Trap. When a German shell penetrated, the gasoline engine often ignited. Crews had seconds to escape. Many didn't make it. Yet, the Sherman had advantages. It was reliable. Mechanical breakdowns were rare compared to German tanks. It was easy to repair. A trained crew could replace an engine in 4 hours. Most importantly, it was available. American factories produced 50,000 Shermans during the war. Germany produced fewer than 2,000 Panthers and Tigers combined. Quantity became its own quality. When a Sherman was knocked out, another took its place. When a Panther was destroyed, there was no replacement. Staff Sergeant Robert Thompson commanded a Sherman in the 4th Armored Division. His tank, named Lucky 7, fought from Normandy to Austria in 9 months. It took 14 hits, 3 penetrations. Each time, the crew survived. Each time, the tank was repaired and returned to service. "We weren't the best tank," Thompson said, "but we were always there. The Germans would knock us out, and next day there'd be 5 more Shermans rolling down the road. They couldn't keep up. They'd destroy 1, we'd bring 3. They'd destroy 3, we'd bring 10. Eventually, they just gave up. The advance also depended on the M8 Greyhound armored car, a 6-wheeled vehicle weighing 8 tons, armed with a 37mm gun and a 50 caliber machine gun, maximum speed 55 miles per hour on roads. Its job was reconnaissance. Scout ahead, find the enemy, report back, and avoid combat if possible. Greyhound crews were the eyes of Third Army. They probed every road, every village, every crossroads. When they found Germans, they radioed coordinates. When they found an open route, they marked it, and the tanks followed. Corporal William Bennett drove a Greyhound for the 11th Armored Division. His vehicle covered over 1,000 miles in April alone. We'd race ahead, he recalled, sometimes 20 miles in front of the main column. We'd roll into a town. Germans would stare at us, and we'd wave and keep going. Half the time, they thought we were their own troops retreating. By the time they figured it out, our tanks would arrive. But speed created vulnerability. The faster Third Army advanced, the longer and thinner its supply lines became. At maximum extension, supplies traveled over 400 miles from depots in France to frontline units in Bavaria. That meant 2 days of travel time. Minimum. Any disruption could leave tanks without fuel, soldiers without ammunition. German commanders understood this. On April 7th, a Luftwaffe pilot named Hans Rudel attacked an American supply column near Fulda. Flying a Stuka dive bomber, he destroyed 6 fuel trucks before being driven off by anti-aircraft fire. Those 6 trucks carried 30,000 gallons of gasoline, enough for 200 tanks to travel 100 miles. The attack forced the 4th Armored Division to halt for 8 hours while more fuel was brought forward. Patton was furious. He ordered increased air cover for supply routes and placed anti-aircraft guns every 20 miles along the main roads. There were no more successful attacks. The Germans also tried cutting the supply lines with ground forces. Small battle groups, usually SS troops, would infiltrate behind American lines and attack convoys. On April 9th, near Eisenach, a company of SS paratroopers ambushed a supply column. They destroyed 12 trucks and killed 17 American soldiers before being wiped out by a quick reaction force. These attacks were pinpricks, annoying but not decisive. The volume of supplies flowing forward was simply too great. Lose a dozen trucks, and 50 more arrived the next day. The American industrial and logistical machine could absorb losses that would cripple any other army. Colonel Richardson, the logistics chief, described it plainly. The Germans were trying to drain an ocean with a bucket. Yes, they could destroy individual trucks, but we had thousands. They could blow bridges. We built new ones in hours. They could mine roads. We had engineers clearing them around the clock. The system was too large, too redundant, too flexible to stop. Communication was another critical factor. Third Army used radio extensively. Every tank, every company headquarters, every battalion command post had radios. This allowed real-time coordination impossible in previous wars. When a reconnaissance unit found an opening, they could radio back immediately. Headquarters could redirect forces within minutes. Tanks could call for artillery support and have shells landing within 5 minutes. The Germans, by contrast, relied heavily on telephone lines, which American artillery cut constantly. German commanders often had no idea where their own units were, let alone the enemy. By April, Wehrmacht communication had broken down almost completely. Orders took hours or days to reach frontline units, by which time the situation had changed entirely. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Harkins, Third Army's Deputy Chief of Staff, noted the difference. We could adjust our plans 5 times a day based on new information. The Germans were working with information 12 hours old. In a fast-moving battle, 12 hours might as well be 12 days. The world had changed. Air support multiplied Third Army's effectiveness. By April of 1945, the Allies had absolute air superiority. The Luftwaffe had been destroyed. A few German planes still flew, but they were hunted relentlessly. American P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs owned the sky. These fighters provided constant cover for advancing columns. They attacked any German movement, trains, trucks, marching columns. Anything that moved was a target. They also served as scouts. Pilots radioed locations of German units, allowing Third Army to avoid strong positions and strike weak ones. Captain Robert Johnson flew a P-47 in support of Third Army. In April, he flew 32 missions. "We'd take off at dawn," he said, "and fly over the front looking for targets. German tanks trying to move to a new position. Strafe them. Supply convoy on a road. Bomb it. Artillery battery setting up. Hit it with rockets. Then we'd land, refuel, rearm, and do it again. Sometimes 3 times a day." The psychological impact was enormous. German soldiers learned that moving during daylight was suicide, so they moved at night, which meant they moved slowly and arrived exhausted. American soldiers, protected by air cover, moved whenever they wanted, another advantage that compounded over time. But the advance was not without cost. Though casualties were light compared to earlier battles, men still died, tanks still burned, soldiers still suffered. Private First Class Raymond Shaw, an infantryman in the 26th Infantry Division, was killed on April 10th near Coburg. A German sniper shot him through the neck. He was 19 years old, from Iowa. He had survived Normandy, the Battle of the Bulge, and 3 months of continuous combat. He died 3 weeks before the war ended in a small German town whose name most Americans couldn't pronounce. His squad leader, Sergeant James Foster, wrote to Shaw's parents, "Your son was a good soldier and a good man. He never complained. He did his duty. He died quickly and did not suffer." These were the standard words. Foster had written the same letter 9 times before. He would write it twice more before the war ended. The truth was harsher. Shaw had bled out over 30 minutes, calling for his mother. The medic could do nothing. They were under fire. They couldn't evacuate him. Foster held his hand until he stopped breathing. Then they left his body and kept moving. There was no time for anything else. This was the reality behind the statistics, behind the maps with their bold arrows, behind Patton's speeches about speed and aggression. Young men died in mud and blood, screaming or silent, brave or terrified. Dead was dead, but the advance saved lives too. Every day the war continued, people died, in concentration camps, under artillery bombardment, from starvation and disease. The faster Third Army moved, the sooner it ended. This was Patton's calculation. Push hard now, lose some men, but save thousands by ending it quickly. Was he right? The numbers suggest yes. Third Army's rapid advance through Germany resulted in fewer casualties than slower, more cautious operations elsewhere. The British 21st Army Group, advancing more methodically in the north, suffered higher casualty rates per mile gained. Soviet forces, using mass frontal assaults, lost 10 times as many men taking half the territory. Patton's methods were brutal, but they worked. On April 12, 1945, President Franklin Roosevelt died. The news reached Third Army the next morning. Patton ordered flags lowered to half-staff. He said nothing publicly. In his diary, he wrote simply, "The old man is gone. History will judge him. I must finish this war." There was no time for mourning. The advance continued. By April 15th, Third Army had reached the Czech border. Eisenhower ordered them to halt. The Allies had agreed with the Soviets on demarcation lines. Czechoslovakia would be liberated by the Red Army. Patton was to stop and consolidate. He complied, reluctantly. He believed Third Army could have taken Prague before the Soviets reached it. Perhaps he was right, but politics overruled military considerations. The alliance with the Soviet Union was more important than who reached Prague first. The halt gave soldiers a chance to rest. For the first time in weeks, they stopped moving. They slept in buildings instead of foxholes. They ate hot food. They wrote letters home. They cleaned weapons and repaired equipment. They tried to process what they had experienced. Many couldn't. The pace of the advance had been so frenetic, the experiences so compressed, that minds simply shut down. Men sat and stared, spoke in monosyllables, functioned mechanically. Today, we call it combat stress, psychological trauma. In 1945, they called it battle fatigue. Captain Daniel Morton, a battalion surgeon, treated dozens of cases. The symptoms were consistent: 1,000-yard stare, inability to sleep, violent reactions to sudden noises, emotional numbness. These men weren't wounded physically, but they were casualties. Nonetheless, we moved so fast, Morton observed, that soldiers never had time to process what happened. You'd see something terrible, a friend killed, a concentration camp, a burned village. But the column kept moving. You had to keep up, so you buried it, shoved it down, kept functioning. But eventually the mind can't handle it anymore. When we finally stopped, men fell apart. The army had no real treatment. Rest, food, and reassurance. Most men recovered enough to function. Some didn't. They were evacuated to rear area hospitals. A few never recovered at all. This was another cost of the rapid advance. One not counted in casualty statistics, psychological wounds that would haunt men for decades. But there were positive moments too. The liberation of prisoner-of-war camps was among them. On April 14th, elements of the 14th Armored Division reached Stalag 7A near Moosburg, a massive camp holding over 100,000 prisoners. Americans, British, French, Soviet, Italian, soldiers from every nation that had fought Germany. When American tanks rolled through the gates, the prisoners erupted, cheering, crying, shouting. Men who had been captive for years, suddenly free. Sergeant Thomas Martin remembered it vividly. They rushed the tanks, climbed all over them, slapping us on the back, hugging us, grown men crying like children. It was overwhelming. One British officer, captured at Dunkirk in 1940, 5 years earlier, just kept saying, "You came. You actually came." The Americans distributed food, medical supplies, and cigarettes. Army photographers documented everything. Prisoners gave testimony about their treatment. The evidence would be used at war crimes trials. For the soldiers who liberated the camps, it was validation. Proof that the war had meaning, that the sacrifices had purpose. They weren't just conquering territory. They were freeing people, ending evil. It mattered. On May 5th, Third Army received reports of German peace feelers. Wehrmacht commanders wanted to surrender, but only to the Americans and British, not to the Soviets. They feared Soviet vengeance. Eisenhower refused partial surrender. It was unconditional or nothing. On May 7th, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. Official ceasefire took effect at midnight on May 8th. Third Army soldiers greeted the news with quiet relief. No cheering, no celebrations, just exhaustion and gratitude. They had survived. Patton addressed his army on May 9th. "Men," he said, "the war in Europe is over. You have accomplished the impossible. You have defeated the best army in the world. You have liberated millions. You have avenged your fallen comrades. Be proud. History will remember what you did." Then he added, characteristically, "Now, get cleaned up. We might have to go fight the Japanese." That threat never materialized. The atomic bombs ended the Pacific War in August. Third Army soldiers went home, back to farms and factories and families, back to lives interrupted by war. Most tried to forget. They didn't talk about it, didn't dwell on it. They had jobs to find, families to raise, futures to build. The war was over. Time to move on. But they couldn't completely forget. The memories remained. The sounds, the smells, the faces of friends who didn't come home. The speed of the advance compressed into memory, like a fever dream. 600 miles in 72 hours, an impossible achievement that they had somehow accomplished. Historians have studied Patton's final offensive endlessly. Doctoral dissertations, staff college lectures, war games, and simulations. The consensus is clear. It was one of the most successful military operations of the 20th century. A masterclass in mobile warfare. Proof that speed, aggression, and bold leadership can achieve results far beyond what conventional wisdom suggests possible. But for the men who lived it, the analysis is simpler. They were told to go. They went. They were told not to stop. They didn't stop. They did their jobs. That's all. The machines that carried them, the Shermans and Greyhounds and half-tracks, were scrapped or sold. A few ended up in museums, most were melted down. The steel recycled, turned into cars and refrigerators and building frames. The roads they traveled are still there. Autobahns and country lanes, villages and cities. The battlefields are quiet now, marked with memorials or forgotten entirely. But what Third Army did in March and April of 1945 changed warfare forever. It demonstrated that modern armies could move faster and farther than anyone thought possible. That logistics could support operations at unprecedented tempo. That air power and mechanization could create a form of warfare where the enemy simply couldn't react fast enough. The principles established by Patton's advance influenced military doctrine for generations. The Israeli armored offensives in 1967, the American drive to Baghdad in 2003, the emphasis on speed, flexibility, and decisive action all trace back to what Third Army proved possible, and the lesson remains relevant. In war, hesitation is dangerous. Caution can be costly. Sometimes the boldest course is the safest, because the enemy that cannot find you cannot hurt you, and an enemy constantly reacting has no time to plan effective defense. 600 miles in 72 hours. Impossible on paper, achieved in reality by ordinary men in extraordinary circumstances, led by a commander who understood that modern war rewards the swift and punishes the slow. When Hitler heard of the advance, he understood, too late to matter, but he understood that Germany had lost not just because of resources or numbers, but because the other side had learned to move faster, to think faster, to act faster. Speed had become the ultimate weapon, and Patton wielded it perfectly. The war ended. The soldiers went home. The tanks were scrapped. But the lesson endured, and it endures still. In the end, Patton's greatest achievement was not the territory captured or the enemy defeated. It was proving that in modern warfare, the side that refuses to stop cannot be stopped. The side that keeps moving forward through exhaustion and casualties and doubt will eventually win, not because it is stronger or better equipped, but because momentum itself becomes a weapon. 600 miles in 72 hours, a number that seems impossible. That defied all military logic. That terrified an enemy and inspired an army. That ended a war weeks or months earlier than it might have otherwise ended, and saved thousands of lives in the process. This is the story of Patton's final offensive, not a story of superhuman soldiers or invincible tanks, but a story of ordinary people doing extraordinary things because someone believed they could and refused to let them stop until they did. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.